Yeah.
Just remember everything you just said.
Flex channel.
All right. So quick recap. The different stuff we were discussing. I was talking about the different ways that you can do styling of React applications or React components. The biggest thing to take away at top level is that pretty much all of them go with a different approach than traditional separation of concerns. So traditionally, you're separating out your JavaScript, your CSS, and your HTML as different layers, and you want to keep those separate. But React tends to prefer the notion of a component is your separation. So if you have a component that is a button component, that has a lot of times the notion of the markup, the styling, and the behavior all sort of separated out for that button, as opposed to creating it in these separate layers. And we talked about a few different ways to do some of the styling. It's still perfectly acceptable, although you're violating that new sort of React separation of concerns, to just put your styling in like an index.css file and use class names on components. But obviously that's going to be having this index.css file know about a lot of different components. So it doesn't do a good job of separating those concerns out. Alternative approach that's very popular is to have separate CSS files for each component. So you can see here, we've got an app.css, and then we have app.js that imports that CSS file into it. And that allows you to create these separate CSS files and create that connection and that sort of component mindset where the styling is tied to that component and being imported. Now the file is still separate. There's nothing that forces it to only be imported in one component. And you could still, that styling in just most of the approaches that use this, this class name could be used in, say, a different component, and it's possible to break that separation of concern using this. But it is, I mean, most of the major projects I've worked on have followed this as the styling approach. And that's because people are comfortable with it. They're familiar with it. They've got some external style sheets that they already are using in places, and it fits right into their model, their build system, whatever. And then we were just talking about one that's very React, sort of an approach that's almost going old school, but has some real popularity, is the notion of just going back to the old style attribute directly on your elements and defining your styles directly inside of your component files. So the syntax on that varies a little bit because React will automatically convert camel case syntax to dash syntax. So if this was being written in, a CSS file, you would write as order radius instead of order uppercase radius. But React does that for you so that you get to stick with the more common JavaScript syntax of camel casing while you're writing stuff. And then you can just apply it directly with a style attribute. Like I say, very popular. This is probably, this is about, I don't know, 3 years ago, somebody talked about going down this approach, and it's been sort of debated and tweaked ever since. And so then you get into, these are all the really lightweight solutions, right? So if you don't have a lot of complex needs and you're just doing something simple, like all of these work as great ways to style components in React. But then you definitely have some unique constraints or capabilities that you can leverage because, and this will probably be almost too much. Well, let me put this back here for now. I haven't even tried to look this up. So let me see if I can even Oh, they're only talking about 3. There are Radium might be the one that I know of that some of these other ones. So there are literally hundreds or dozens, if you will, of solutions for inline styling in React, where they build a whole bunch of different options and different ways to do some of this stuff. Let me.
This is the hover you were talking about.
Yeah, those are some of the things that you can't get with some of these, like Radium can support. Says it provides hover and active, but it can't provide some of the other ones that exist. Some of these pseudo selectors.
What were the other things that you say that using the inline styling doesn't support, like pseudo classes and animations?
Some animations, depending on the way that you're doing stuff, because you can do sort of keyframe aspects as sort of class-based things to apply some of that styling. And so if you don't have the ability to define a selector, so anything that the crux of it is anything that requires a selector and you don't have access to just as the inline style bit are things that you're going to have a hard time if you do inline styling. So that includes stuff like hover, because, and that's what I was getting back to over here, right? So if we added like some styling here, like we wanted some extra styling to happen only when we're hovering over this, we could do .app hover. And now we could say like, okay, now let's change our text color to blue or something, or sorry, I always do text. I cannot remember that color is how you, just for the life of me, it's never going to click. So what should happen here, right, is if I'm over here, don't have a color change, but whenever I'm hovering over it, I didn't write any code to do that. That's just styling doing that change for us, just CSS, right? Which is really nice, really convenient. But there is literally no way to do this selector with a direct inline style, because apply. If you're trying to do something and you wanted to go straight inline styles, you have to write hover logic yourself to say, when you're hovering over this component, change my style over to this instead of what it is right here. So those are the types of things that can be limitations with this approach.
Are they ever combined? Maybe that's the worst of all worlds, but if you did it inline and then added a sheet, a style sheet for hover.
Yeah, they're definitely combined.
Someone's tried that.
We have to do it sometimes.
Okay.
Oh, here we go. This is what I was looking for.
Pseudo classes are pretty essential. I think.
Oh, they are, yeah, yeah.
Hover
and so that's why you'll see, like, if we go over here to there, so they mention that they support some of this stuff. They support browser state styles, and that's because, you know, Radium is doing, Radium's doing some special logic where you actually wrap your guy. So this gets into, we can't talk about all of the different styling libraries and options that exist. This is what I was trying to bring up here. This, ever since this sort of CSS and JS stuff has sort of taken off, this is a comparison of some of the different options that have been built since then, which is crazy, right? So there's a whole bunch of opinions, a whole bunch of debate over what's the best way to solve this. Here's pros and cons of some of them. Here's different directions. So I'll talk about, I think styled components is a really good one. It's really popular. The syntax is really weird. So recognize that it might take just a little bit to get used to the strange syntax. What? Styled components? You use them?
A little bit.
But so we'll take a quick look at what styled components look like. And this is another way to accomplish something where you're sort of writing your styling in the file. And then I'll talk a little bit about how some of these tools work and what they do to allow you to do some of this stuff in unique ways. And then we'll look at the idea of not even necessarily defining your styles. If you want to get some cool styling, you can pull in a whole package like a UI library that will give you stuff without having to necessarily define it yourself. And that's what we'll spend the second half of the day on. So there's a lot of different, again, like I said, a lot of different things that do these sort of inline styling or other styling like that. This is an example of styled components. And this is just yet another library that you can go pull down. So here, they're just importing styled from styled components and doing something a little weird where they're creating a title React component using this odd syntax. Now, these backticks should be familiar because that's just a template literal string. We've written some of those. So what's inside of that is just a template literal string right in there. But what this is essentially doing is saying what I want to create, what I want the titled component to be is an H1 element with this styling built into it as part of it. So that's very similar to this button. I want a button with this styling, and that's what I'm returning there as my button, and other people can leverage that. This is saying my title component is really an H1 element with this styling applied. And then you can just use that just like you can any other element. But some of what this gives you is, you notice, well, first off, the syntax difference here was you didn't have to write this using camel case. So some people prefer to get it right there CSS using CSS syntax because they're very comfortable with it, very familiar with it. That's what the styled component bit gives you. And what's actually happening, and we could dig into that, but I'm not going to go pull down all of the bits and pieces, I don't think, to set up styled components on this project right now. Let me see if I can actually find to have a reference.
You can also do like a different one.
Here we go. If I go over here, I'm sure they will. I'll bet you all of this is. Be able to see what I'm trying to talk about here a little bit, but I may not have the. Do I have the React tools in here? Maybe I don't.
You can reuse that title if you need just only to change the font. So you put style title and you use another one.
Right, another styled component bit. Yep.
Without writing again.
Mm-hmm. So I may not have the React stuff built in here. Hold on. Do we have examples here? Oh, that should be a good example. What's that? Because of the emoji? Oh, yes. So here we go. This is a great example if we actually look over here. So we've got this button, this normal button. I clicked a normal button. And if we look in the DOM at what's happening, we can see that we didn't actually inline style, right? That's not inlining it as a style attribute on it the same way that we just wrote it. Instead, what they're doing is when you create a styled component like this button was created, and it's got the example of creating it, which we'll look at again in a moment. During your build process using Webpack and going through that process, it actually generates a class that it's going to apply to it to give you your styled component bits. So now if we come back over here and we say, all right, we're trying to add some styling to our button, like this guy here. This is a styled button, And we can see some of the styling here, border radius 3 pixels, the padding, the margin. You can see that they generated a unique class name for this component and applied it during our build so that you didn't have to manage any of the class naming aspects of it, but you still got to work with all the characteristics of having an actual class and working with classes and working with CSS and that syntax instead of having to do inline styling. So this is the sort of way that a lot of these solutions are working, is a lot of these libraries that are built on top of it, if you're not doing styling yourself, using CSS files or inlining it, a lot of them are, during your build process, are adding some class names or injecting the styling or injecting behavior to get their styling into your stuff in sort of an efficient way. So, I mean, I definitely would encourage people to play around with some of these and see how the different approaches work for styling components when you want to do your own styling. But you're just fine also just straight up sticking with CSS files or inline styling or any mix of that works. Are there any questions so far? No? All right. So the next thing, or option, I want to talk about today was the idea of you don't necessarily have to do your styling yourself. And this is what happens when you're working with front end like components or frameworks. But this also, I think it's almost cleaner than any other framework I've worked with, is being able to pull in some of these libraries for React is just so easy because it uses this component-based model, right? The idea is a component is encapsulated. It contains all of these different behaviors, or tries to. So you can go, there are tons of different UI frameworks that exist that you could pull down for React. I'm just choosing one sort of arbitrarily here. But this is what we'll use today instead of direct styling for the most part. It's in here, but this is what we'll use to get a lot of styling of our elements very easily and a lot of cool behavior without having to do it all directly. So the process here, and I haven't done any of this intentionally so that, we'll sort of all walk through it if other people want to see it together, because I know we haven't pulled in a whole bunch of other dependencies into our projects. So this is really the process you would follow anytime you're pulling something in. You would have done this if you pulled in styled components. You're pulling in this. Is you got to go find out right now, how do I go install? This looks really cool. Let's go look at some of the component demos. Like, I want to get these cool buttons in my stopwatch, which even have this like animation, hover behavior and stuff. I want to get some of that in, but I don't know how to do it. So we'll go ahead and get through the getting started bit. So this should look just like anything else. We're going to npm install our dependency. All right, this is pretty simple. I can literally cut and paste this. Now, usually, although we're on a newer version of npm, so you don't always have to do this, you want to say save so that you're making sure you're saving your dependency in your package.json file. And this is going to go pull down whatever else it needs for this package. So while that's happening, we'll step back over and take a look and say, all right, do we have some other dependencies that it tells me about here, right? So it tells me it's designed with the Roboto font. Nice and easy here. We're gonna steal their instructions. We're gonna straight up steal this Roboto font line because they've got it here for us, telling us how to get them included. It says it will not be automatically loaded, so we need to load it up ourselves, and that's what they gave us a reference to here. or we could install it using npm if we want. So we've got, again, these two options, right? If we were going to use the direct line, we would just add something into our index.html. But I really love the simplicity of being able to just import something and have all those dependencies sort of declared inside of my JavaScript instead of having to declare them elsewhere, and I can see them all being imported. So I'll just install that as well as another dependency. And then while that's being installed, because I'm going to want that font across everything, I'll go up to this top level app.js, or we could even go to index.js if we want. And we could import that. I think that's what it was. Let me go double check. Typeface-roboto. Okay. So we're adding in this import. We've got that, and then it tells us if we want to use font icons, we need to import the material icons. So if we end up using the font icons, we'll come back and pull this in. But right now, let's just start with these first two bits that we have. And let's say, all right, well, now I want to make my buttons. That's the first thing I want to make prettier on here, right? I don't know. We could choose anything. Double check. Looks like everything's installed fine. Look, they're using yet another CSS and JavaScript solution, JSS. I mean, we wouldn't want to have any sort of standard, would we? No. That would be crazy. So let's, I'm not kidding. This is the way that, especially when you're just getting started with any of this, this is probably the way that you would do any of this. So a lot of times you'll go to the page and it'll just have example this for one of these and some of these examples directly. So what do we think? Do we want our buttons to just be sort of in these text buttons without any border around them, these sort of outlined buttons, or these contained ones here that have full color behind them? We've got other options too. We could have a floating action button. What? Or, you know, other stuff, but icons and labels. Here's some more customized ones. These are also crazy buttons, but that would take a little more. So let's make a choice between these first three. What do we want? Text, outlined, or contained? Any preferences? Contained? All right, let's go with the contained button. Because I'm lazy, I'm just going to go right over here, because this is what a lot of them will do. Now, I'm not going to pull in the styling at first, this extra styling, because I think that's some extra work. So we'll just grab, all right, well, I need to import a button from here. But this is going to cause us a problem that you should see pretty quickly, because we want to make our button component work this way. Oops. Well, what the? I don't know what just happened there. That was weird. Oh. Here we go. So we imported a button there. So let's change to use that button. Maybe this actually works without having a problem. We're exporting a button, but it may not have a conflict. I thought it would have a conflict with the fact that we're exporting something named button, but it might not. So I'm going to get rid of this style that we were applying. I'll leave it up there, but just get rid of that. And we'll see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. Ah, there we go. There's our complaint, right? Because
there's 2 buttons.
we exported something named, so we can change the name of this. When you import something, you can if you want. Say I'm importing this as something else. So I'm just going to call it a material button. So it has a new, different name.
But it's like fixing the problem. Change the name.
Because now when I refer to it in here, I need to call it a material button instead of a button in order to use it correctly. Let me see here. I may have this syntax wrong. This should work. Let me double check. Oh, you know what? I don't have to do this. Because I'm importing the default export, I can call it whatever I want to call it in here. I don't have to say as. That's what I did wrong. So you have to say as if it's a named export. But if it's the default export, you can actually call it whatever you want when you import it. It doesn't have to have any relationship to what it was called when exported.
Whoa.
So there we go. We've got some sort of button.
That looks cool.
Look at what we just got with
Pretty good.
no additional work, right? So that's the power that you start getting when you start pulling in some of these packages and being able to reuse some of that. But this definitely isn't exactly what we were going for. We don't have our contained stuff. And that's because while we pulled this in and changed over to use it, we didn't read on what we actually need to do here. So if you went down here, you could look at, they'll have API documentation, like saying, here's all of the different properties that this button can accept. And, oh, it can accept disabled. Hey, look at that. It accepts disabled, convenient for us. The disabled's already working. We didn't have to do anything for that to work with their button. It may or may not be a coincidence that the name is very similar. But you can see all of these are different properties that you can set in one way or another on their button component. And one of them, let's see here, is this variant. And by default, this is the default value, it's text. And then the other options are flat, outlined, contained, etc. If we go back and look at our button that we wanted to do, this contained button, we can see that's exactly what we need to do. We just need to set a variant equals contained on our material button to change over to contain style buttons. I'm even getting this nice Google, Material UI bit. So we got a lot of cool aspects that we got very, very easily. But it's still a little boring. Let's use some of these other elements of it, right? Let's make this start button, let's make that a primary one. And so we'll set the color to primary for that. And then we'll do secondary for our other button. So now we're getting into something where we can't just do it down here in our button component anymore. But we still want to leverage some of that. So we have to come up here and pass something down into our button. But that's easy. We're just going to say our color is primary for this guy. And that should get passed into our button automatically. But since this is a wrapper around a material button, we're going to have to pass it down through as well into our material button. So that means we need to add this color equals props.color to make sure that it passes down through into the material button. Otherwise, it would be stuck just there. So if we didn't pass it down, then yeah, our button component would know about it, but Material UI wouldn't, so it wouldn't actually change the styling. Right? That makes sense?
Why didn't you just put, I think I just missed the first part. Why didn't you put color primary just here?
Let's try it.
Why do you need to pass it as props? Is that just to get the one button?
Yeah.
Okay.
So let's try that, because if we do it there,
Okay.
they're both going to have the same color because they're both using this. And so each one of them is creating an instance of this. So what we need to do is let them differ. And since we want the color to differ between the two of them, we need to let the buttons themselves, the buttons up above, say, here's my color, and pass it down through.
Is that what you had? The primary one, that little part inside the actual start.
Yeah, that's why the start button says the color is primary. But this thing doesn't do anything with that property, so we need to pass it down another layer, which is why I passed it down through here. And this is definitely a common pain point in React. So this is getting into one of those things that is known as this is painful at times, passing props down through multiple components to get them. It can be frustrating. It's definitely the easiest thing to get used to. And to help deal with that, and there's different approaches, but one that happens quite frequently is the idea of only, so this gets into a sort of complex bit of newer JavaScript syntax. But what you can do is pull off the properties that you care about and then put everything else into another object and just pass it down through. So if you don't care about it, you don't have to pass them through manually. So if this guy says, oh, what I care about is, well, onClick is actually just getting passed right through, right? At this point, I'm not doing anything with it. So I don't even actually care about that. I could just pass it through directly. Disabled, well, that's just getting passed straight through. Color, that's getting passed straight through. But children, well, I mean, maybe it doesn't matter, but children I care about, let's say, right? So one approach that people have to deal with this is something like this. It would be like, all right, get the children property. And this is, we haven't used this syntax a lot. This is something sort of magical. It looks at this props object, looks for a key with the name children, and then assigns it to this variable that's being declared right there. And then what I'm going to...
That would be children equals children, or no?
This would be the equivalent of... So right now, what I have written here. So if I left this, right? That's the equivalent of children equals props.children, right? But you could do it with even more. You could also add in other ones on click. And now I'm creating multiple single name variables here at the same time and just pulling them out of this object. It's what's known as dereferencing, and it's a very common syntax that you'll encounter in a lot of React type code.
Wait, so with that, instead of having the props.onClick, could you put the children or the onClick part?
I could just put onClick, and over here I could just put children. Yep, and we can see that. Give it a moment, make sure it built, and we should work just fine. Passing our onClick through. And we can strip, we can strip any of them off that we want to work with. But again, on click, we're really just passing through, and even disabled, we're just passing through now, right? So really we're not doing anything with it in this component. So there's another little bit of shorthand syntax where what you can do is do this ... and then just give this item whatever name you want it to have. So I'm going to call it other props. What we're going to get here is we're going to pull the children property out of this props object. And then we're going to create a whole nother object with everything except that children property.
Okay, that's a little confusing.
It is, yeah. But it's, I mean, so yeah, the result of this is we'll have a children and an other props variable here. Children will have whatever the value was of props.children. And then other props will be an object with everything else that was in the props, original props object.
But without the children.
But without the children. Yep. And so then to go with that, what a lot of people will do if they're following that approach and they're just passing stuff down through, and then you can use that same sort of syntax to say, pass the other props down through this, because I didn't care about doing anything with those. I just want to pass them through. And that's a syntax for doing that. And then you don't have to have pulled them all off directly. So there's pros and cons to each approach. There's not this is the right way, like other props is the right way to do that. It is really nice sometimes to do something like this. Like even if you're going to pass them through, because it lets a lot of this stuff get nice and clean, especially if you're going to reference those variables multiple times in a component. You can sort of clean this stuff as much.
So you can kind of like take off things while simultaneously adding something else.
You can. Now recognize this props nothing changed in this props object, right? It's only these variables. What it did was we now have references in these variables to different aspects of it, but this props object itself is still the same thing that it was before. We did that. But yeah, now, I mean, hey, that's really cool. We got some nice slick buttons and we didn't really have to do anything. So now we can pull in some of their other logic here. And this, I don't even know what this is doing. We could pull in some of their styling to do margins if we wanted, or we could not, because we could easily just, if we go down here and we look at our button, we can see that we can always apply classes. So if we want to add our own styling using classes, even with this, that's perfectly valid. It doesn't have any issue with us setting them that way. And there's a lot of other variables that we can set here to change our styling for our components. And I'll bet you these guys are part of a button base. I'll bet you button base. I don't see it. I was wondering if, let's just experiment. Let's see if it works. Let's see if I can do some style on this guy. I don't know if it's going to work or not. Oh, I need to double braces because the first one is escaping the JavaScript and the second one's telling you it's a JavaScript object. So let's see if that gave it some margin. And the reason it dropped down there, if you're not sure, is because I told it my width is so small. So since I gave it such a narrow width, there wasn't space for both of them to render at the same level. So it went under, yep. And then we could say, okay, well, maybe we want our clear button, right? Like this guy should have a color of secondary. So now his color will change. So when he's enabled, he'll be this sort of secondary color. We got a lot of really nice behavior that we got without having to do a lot of work. So this is like the benefit. And you notice another great part about this is what did we have to change? Like, what components did we have to change to get this styling? To get that base shared styling changed over, because we've switched over to this component model, and because both of these other buttons were already built on top of a underlying button component, we only had to change this underlying button component, right? So if we now in the future say, oh man, we would really like to swap that out for a whole different look for our button,
We would just change the button.
we only have this nice self-contained little button that we have to change. We don't have to go in and touch a whole bunch of different pieces of code. We've got a nice self-contained component that encapsulates that logic, and changing it spreads it throughout our whole application. Right? And this is just touching the surface. So if we get into these demos, we could add a whole bunch of other aspects to this. So we could say, you know, field type markup. And this is just one UI library. There's so many different ones that we have or could leverage, you know. We could have cards. One thing that I'll be encouraging people to work on after this, if you guys didn't already, I don't know if you guys worked on this at all, is the idea of being able to have a lap button on the stopwatch, right? If you've ever used stopwatch, a lot of times you can hit a lap button and it'll record the time on the lap. And so that'll be really the last thing that we're going to add to this sort of stopwatch in terms of, you know, visible functionality most likely. And then after that, we'll have some classes where we're talking about some of these other concepts in React and some of the more advanced things like using higher order containers and some other stuff. But that'll be the last major thing that we add. But you can already look here and say, oh man, there's some nice things I could leverage to make a list of, oh, here's a list. Your dividers. Maybe I'm going to create a list dynamically with these different dividers, and they'll show my lap times. You know, maybe we want them all hidden, and you can expand it and sort of see the lap show up when you expand it. So, but you don't always necessarily have to have written all these components by hand. You can just sort of pull them in and start leveraging them. And so let's grab at least one more. Let's grab this paper.
This is a sheet of paper.
This is very simple. It's a sheet of paper, because this is all supposed to be material design inspired stuff. So this is a sheet of paper. That's what we're going to pull in. And we're going to put our whole stopwatch on a sheet of paper. We're going to say, man, I really want this whole thing to, I usually tend to put my third-party imports up above all my own ones. So that's just a personal preference syntax-wise. But we're just going to go ahead and wrap this whole thing in a sheet of paper. And say paper with an elevation of, I don't know, they've got like 16 layers or something like that, I think. Now we have to end it just like anything else. We'll indent this stuff so that it's correct, and let's see if this worked. I don't know. We've got our sort of stopwatch bit here, self-contained in this little sheet of paper, popping off the page, right? And the reason this isn't in there is just because I had that external. I could easily put it there. Or instead, let's say, yeah, I don't want this wrapped around. Let me back this stuff out. This isn't what I wanted. I wanted this paper around my whole app. So I'm just going to come up to my app level and, oops, get this import statement right for my materials stuff. And then let's put this paper around all of this. Let's make it a little lower. We don't want it to look quite as crazy. I'll just indent these guys. Now we've got our stopwatch set off on a little piece of paper. Looks separate. All right, we just gave it a whole bunch of styling like that without having to do any real work. And if we want to change that, I don't think so, but that would be an awesome prank to have in here. Really all it means with paper is it just means elevated. So I think that's the only thing that this is doing is just popping it off the background so that it looks like a sheet of paper. See, they've got like 24 different levels of elevation.
We should do
What's
the elevation.
24?
Yeah, we should do 24.
Hold on, let me change this a tiny bit so that we can see stuff side by side. Oh, would that work? I don't know if that's gonna work. Let me try something here. That might work. Ding ding. Oh, man, so magic. All right. So yeah, we can play with it, right?
That's a good little shadow.
Like it's popped up, the shadow is much larger. That's basically what it does. It just looks like it's much higher, right? So you can go with a very subtle one, like let's go with a 2, and you should have a very subtle shadow around it.
If we wanted to, could we create like our own elevation? Just make it like totally absurd, like lift off the thing completely.
Yeah, I mean, you could play around with anything around that stuff, but this is just an example of leveraging some of those components really easily, right? We didn't have to do a ton of work. There's not a lot of complexity to what we just did. These components. They even have some of these other guys, like I don't even know what this backdrop component is, but it looks like there's another one there that sort of gives you a backdrop behind stuff. Oh, it's probably for when you have animated stuff in. Like if you wanted, let's look at some of the other components that this provides. So, you know, I think we're all probably familiar with the idea of having this drawer that slides out like a mobile application from the left side or right side of your screen with content, right? Boom, there we go. Like if you wanted to get a drawer, I mean, yeah, you don't get everything for free. That's using some of their other components, you know, it's building on some stuff. There's a lot of bits of code and logic in there saying what should happen, but complex to build out yourself. And instead, you know, you're able to leverage pulling in these drawers into your application very easily. Or these chips are another great one. This is an example, like you'll see these all the time in e-commerce, right? So this is the type of thing where it might be like, it's a deletable chip, and so you've selected some things to filter by, and you get some chips like up at the top of your page that say like, oh, you're looking for, you know, shoes, you know, boots or whatever, and you've got like, you know, oh, I can delete these and it'll change my searches and remove them from my search, right? And here's a nice little component that captures a fair bit of that logic for you. You still have to write all the logic of what happens with that, you know, saving that state, rendering these. But at least the UI elements, which can be very tricky, you can leverage this type of stuff very easily to accomplish a lot of things, right? And then, you know, some of them are really useful. Like these are the ones that have been around forever in just about every framework. But like, oh man, it's really nice to have a date picker that you don't have to write yourself because they're a nightmare. You know, here's a time picker, right? I was considering doing that with our stopwatch too, is adding an alarm clock feature so we could set an alarm.
When you get to certain times, like making noise or something.
Yeah, you You can do whatever you want. Make a noise. Flash the whole screen.
Yes,
Have a sleep timer, right?
I'd probably still sleep through that.
Rattle the whole bed.
Yeah.
Anyways, so that's really, I mean, these are the different aspects I wanted to cover today, were these different ways that you can get around to styling your application so that you don't have, you know, just a very boring stopwatch application. And we haven't even done that much to this. There's a lot more we could do, but we already see a whole bunch of style, a whole bunch of behavior that's come out of it without too much effort, and some of the different ways that we can accomplish some of that. So any questions on any of that? You did yours with styled components. If people didn't take a look at
I was thinking about this material UI when you put color primary on the bottom and then you pass the prop. Why it was blue? I mean, because the clear button was red, so it chooses the primary color.
that was just the built-in primary color for
You can change that.
yeah, you can. So
They have it in the documentation.
yeah, if we go over to their documentation, you'll see, so they've got a lot of different stuff here, but if we look at like, okay, here's our style,
Oh, color.
we could define our colors if we want to.
Oh, they have nice. I was just looking at this. They have really nice color pickers, and if you scroll down, like to give you
Oh yeah.
the main color and then the accent color. That's nice.
You don't have to think about the play
Yeah.
and done the scheme.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. So what you would need to do, so I haven't worked with their new, this is the newer version of Material UI. I built apps with their pre 1.0. So it's changed a little bit, but it looks like this is basically what you do, which isn't too hard. So if you want your stuff to have your own style, you want it to be a little different somewhere, it doesn't, you wouldn't usually do this in a component, like in a component file, it's yourself. So we can go ahead and pull this and show you, you know, what you would do. But typically you're not going to be doing this in a component file, because a component should be that encapsulated, that self-contained element or behavior. Hey, look at our stopwatch is responsive. Yeah. So usually what you would do is, you know, here you would have something like, we're going to create a new file and we're going to say theme.js or something, right? And that's, now we'll just steal what they had. So we're changing what our Material UI theme is. And the palettes and behavior should change. I may have to, did that change anything over here? So I may have to change, may have to do some other work to get that to apply. Let me see here.
You have to.
I have to, yeah, I have to use the,
theme.js.
I think I have to use the theme somehow, like import it. So I haven't played with this enough yet to see how that works. But typically what you'd be doing is defining a theme for your whole app.
So then you just put primary and
And then you'd be defining all of that.
takes that from
Having to yourself, you can just leverage the concept of what they already have, change it to be themed the way you want, and then still use those same components. So let me see here. Oh, because the idea is, okay, so what we've done, I get it. We've created a theme here, right? But we're not, this isn't overriding their theme. This is just creating a theme that can be used. So you could create some different themes. And then they have, no, you've got to have the documentation somewhere for how to use your theme. Say they talk about accessing it in a component. But yeah, so what you would usually do is something more like this, right? You wouldn't do it in like a single component. So I'm gonna what you would usually do is now you would go to like your app, for example, and import this theme. And then let's say, we could do this in different ways. Since I created this separate theme file, I'm going to just export this. And then import it over here. And then you could see they had their example over here of applying the theme. So we've got our theme provider now, and that's just a component as well, it looks like. So now we're just going to tell it what the theme is that we want to use, which we just called our theme. Could have called it our app theme, whatever. We want to wrap that around everything. That way we should get that styling, whatever stuff we're applying.
Important theme from theme is not theme.js. Question. The third line.
Oh, you know what? This was named. Yeah, this is. What are you talking about? This line? Yeah, this is where we're importing our theme.
From theme.js?
Yes, this is from theme.js. You don't have to put the .js on if you're using. Yeah. Well, these don't, and they're the same sort of thing. You don't have to for JavaScript files. Okay. So that's another Webpack-y thing, right? Okay. Webpack can make it nice for you, and it'll say like, oh, assume it's a JavaScript file if you don't give me an extension. So if we went and looked in like the Webpack, which we don't get to see because we didn't break out of our create React app stuff, so you can't really see the full Webpack file. But they've got some logic in there that just says like, oh, if I don't have an extension, assume it's this extension. And you could even say assume this extension first, then this one, and it'll look for files with those extensions, and if it finds any of them, it'll use that as your import. So it's just a lazy. You can also write it theme.js, and it's not going to harm anything. It's fine, but I'm lazy and I just prefer the cleaner look. Now, the problem there is when you do that, you've bound yourself to Webpack. So this import syntax and everything, that not including like the CSS import or the font import that we did, this import, when you're importing a JavaScript file, that's part of JavaScript. And so technically, as long as you have like the .js and stuff, that's part of the newer JavaScript standards. So you don't have to have something like Webpack to use that necessarily. But the minute you've done stuff like gotten rid of that syntax or the extension at the end, or you've imported CSS files or like fonts or things like that, that's not part of the JavaScript language itself. That's coming from Webpack, making things easy to work with. And so once you've done that, you're sort of stuck with that sort of build tool. You can't completely get rid of it unless you change the way that you bundle everything. But you get some niceties out of it as well. So yeah, now we've got our theme, and our theme has changed the way stuff looks. And, we can alter it more. We can say like our main color is, or I don't know what our secondary main is, if that's actually applying. I don't know what that's going to give me as a color. I don't even know if it's going to work. We're going to see. Yeah, that's not the worst. So yeah, that's easily allowing you to sort of override that Material UI theme. So you don't have to be stuck with the colors that they have. It takes a little bit of work, a little bit of extra syntax, but not too bad. And we could define several themes so that, now imagine we've created several different themes and we've put a toggle up there or an option for somebody to change the theme. Oh, I prefer this theme on your page, or I prefer this theme. You save that setting. When it loads that theme, but all of your components are the same. You didn't have to touch any code outside of the theming logic, and the rest of it all gets to just be untouched, be nice, clean separation of concerns there. All of the different approaches, whether you're applying your own styling, using CSS files, inline styling, pulling in component libraries, they all have different pros and cons, right? Because you're going to run up, the problem with component libraries is you're quickly going to run up against problems that they don't solve, or I want to do something different and it only does it this way, and now I'm frustrated, you know? So there's never going to be like a perfect answer to how do I get styling, how do I get stuff to look the way I
I
want.
say that you can combine different styling
Yeah.
methods. So if they don't have the helper or whatever pseudo classes, you can add it to the
Yeah.
CSS.
Depending on what your library is that you're pulling in, you might be
Yeah.
able to add it easily. They may be hard, or you can create your own components, right? Not everything that you use has to come from their library. When you're using a third-party library, you're like, it'll be a mix and match. Oh, this is great. I got all these components from them, but I have these custom ones that I had to build. Right? And that's sort of where you end up when you're trying to build out something on the front end like this. Usually, you know, when you're building out something complex, you're mixing and matching. You're pulling some stuff from someone else to speed up your development, and then writing some of your own things because nobody has something that matches your needs. So, all right. Any other questions? Cool. Then I'm going to, I'll get this, gonna probably pull some of this out, clean just a couple things up, and then get this up with the Material UI bits that we've changed in here. And then I think what I'll probably do, and people don't have to follow the same thing, what I'll probably do is then encourage for the next class for people to look at the idea of adding in a laugh timer. So another button that'll let you capture a laugh, which will basically, I'll include the instructions about what that would be, and I don't necessarily expect everybody to have it done by then, but at least have tried to think about it, maybe work towards it. The idea of being able to click a button to capture these different times and save them and display them as well. But yeah, other than that, we'll be done for today. And sorry for the people who are watching this online and missed the more in-depth first 30, 40, whatever minutes. Let me know if you have any follow-up questions. All right. Bye.